Hi guys, so today I wanted to chat a little bit more about the ego. I've been getting some questions around the ego, how it works, separation, and those kinds of questions. And my experience today kind of matched up with those questions and made me think about the ego more and how to work with it and how to come back to the awake space when I'm pulled back into ego identity. And so this morning I woke up and things were feeling a little bit shaky. So I wasn't quite as awake as I have been for a while, and I wasn't quite as present, I wasn't quite as aware as I usually am. And I realized quite early on that there was a desire, an outcome, a story that I had a little attachment to, which was creating my feeling or experience of shakiness and not quite being awake or as awake as I have experienced before. And this desire, this egoic thought pulled me in the wrong direction, into a space of feeling uncomfortable within myself and within what is happening around me in the world. And as soon as I took a moment to reflect on the last week, my ego started to kind of catastrophize everything and make everything seem bigger, the issues and challenges seem bigger. So I've had a few moments here and there in the last week where I felt a little bit the way I did this morning, not quite as awake as I have experienced. And what was then happening when I reflected back on this was that the ego was looking back on the last week and saying that it was a challenging week, rather than seeing it as moments of challenge or uncertainty or just not quite feeling right. And so when I then reflected on that and on what the ego was thinking, what it was saying, I could see that it was just my ego trying to make a meal out of these few moments that I've had interspersed amongst a really beautiful week and really beautiful experiences and connections and moments within this last week. And once I could see that the ego was pulling me into a desire, a story, a specific outcome, and that it was trying to blanket the last week in a feeling of challenge and struggle, I could move from that into the awake space. So seeing it allowed me to disidentify with it, and disidentifying with it was the doorway into becoming awake again and becoming present in my day, in my moment, in this now moment. And so the ego, what it does is it loves to create challenges. It loves to create feelings of separation, whether it's between me and everybody else in the world, or between me and the experience of being awake. All of these me's are the ego. It's the ego saying, look at me, live from me. And it's that identification with the ego that causes the problems. That's what brings us back to suffering. So it's in the belief of the thoughts, the egoic thoughts that are going on in our minds, that causes the problems. And so being in that space, identifying with the ego, is a challenge. It feels like a challenge to move away from, to disidentify with. But all it is a belief in what is going on in the mind. And as soon as we can see that, as soon as we realize that, we can move away from it. And it really is as simple as that. It's seeing what the ego is doing, where it's trying to hook you back in, and where it is bringing you to a place of discomfort or uncertainty or fear or anger or sadness. Even happiness can be within the realm of the ego if it's not permanent. Everything within the ego and within ego identification is in a state of being temporary. So there's no permanence to it. The only way that we can experience true permanent happiness or joy is by living from the true self. And it's really not that difficult to do. You know, once you can see it, once you can identify that the ego is playing its games and it's trying to hook me back in, I can then move beyond that and live again from my true self. And this is what we deal with every day. It's a day-to-day thing. The awakening experience itself is so beautiful because in the moment of awakening, in that session, which is between an hour and a half to 2 hours, depending on who you do it with, but in that session, awakening is such a spontaneous thing. It's such an easy emergence when we start to see the ego, when we disconnect from believing that we are our minds, we are our bodies, or we are our emotions, because we aren't any of those things. We are so much more than that. Our true self is beyond that. And in the awakening experience, in the session, with the right guide or with the right teacher or whoever it is that's taking you through that experience, for me it was, like I mentioned before, my good friend Sheldon Fitzgerald, and the way he did it was really incredibly easy and beautifully done. And that's now what I offer as well, because it is such a beautiful experience. But it's just so easy to move into that awake space, because it's never anywhere other than where we are right now. It's a choice between looking at the world through the filter of the ego and through thoughts and through emotions, as we've always done, or coming to identify with our true self, seeing our true self and living from that space. And that's what being awake is. It's living from your true self, not from the ego. So it's a choice whether I get to live from the ego right now or whether I get to live from my true self right now. And the more you walk along this path, you get to see which one you are identifying more with. And when you identify more with the ego, there are more struggles, there are more challenges, there are more issues. That's where we experience things like stress and anxiety and depression and identifying with traumas that we've experienced. But when we move to the true self, that's where we experience life as being beautiful, as being peaceful, as being blissful, and as being truly connected to the people around us, and living from a space of love. And it's just the most beautiful and profound experience. And the more you go back to that space, the easier it is to stay there permanently. Like with everything, there is a process after the awakening experience, and seeing how easy it is to get into that space, and having that initial glimpse into who you really are and what reality really looks like. From there, the ego tries to hook you back in. And it does that by asking you to believe it, by asking you to believe the thoughts. It doesn't even ask, it just pulls you back in to old ways of being, to the patterns and programs and conditioning that we've lived throughout our lives, which is all learned. None of it is who we really are. And that's what we get to overcome. We get to come back to our true self. And every time we don't identify with a thought, or we allow a thought to pass without hooking ourselves into it and creating emotion around it, which amplifies the thought and takes us further and further down that rabbit hole, we can choose to, at that point when we see it, we can choose to allow it to just move through and not become hooked in. And it's in the not becoming hooked in that we get to live more and more from the true self, from that awake space. And that's what I'm experiencing now. At this point, there are many, many moments where I am awake and everything is bright and beautiful and connected, and I am moving through the world from a place of love. And then there are little moments kind of spread out in between where a thought will come and it will hook me back in a little bit, not quite as much as it used to. It really used to take me very far down that rabbit hole again. But now it's I've been on this journey for around a year, just over a year. And what I didn't do before in the beginning, which I'm doing now, is getting the support on a constant basis to allow me to see, on whether it's weekly or whatever it is, whatever we can however we can plan it, to have those weekly check-ins and sessions where I can come back to clarity and back to the awake space and see how the ego is playing itself out and see where I'm getting hooked back in. And it's in seeing that the next time it tries to play that same game, I'm aware of it. I can see it coming, or I can see it happening as it's happening, and then I get to choose from there. Do I want to follow that road, follow that path into believing the ego and experiencing the emotions that it is creating? Or am I going to allow it, see it and allow it to move through me and out, and from there I can become awake again and clear. And this time around, it's about a few weeks in, 8 to 9 weeks in now, since I started getting regular support. And the way things have cleared up so much easier than it did in the beginning, in the first few months after the awakening experience, because I wasn't getting that regular support, so I wasn't able to see exactly where the ego is hooking me in. But now with that chance once a week or whatever it is, I get to talk about it, and I get to experience or see rather where I am being pulled back in, where I'm being sucked back into believing the thoughts and then experiencing the emotions around that. And I've come so far in the last 8, 9 weeks, 10 weeks, however long it's been now, I can't remember exactly, but I've come really far in that time from identifying with the ego to identifying with the true self on a much more permanent basis. So, as I said, there have been moments of the ego trying to hook itself back in, and then witnessing it, observing what's going on, and going, whoa, okay, hold on, take a step back, see what it's doing, and then from there I can bring myself back to clarity, back to awakeness, back to beingness, and back to presence. And it just becomes easier and easier to see the ego's games and to not buy into it. That's all it wants you to do. It just wants you to buy into it. And that's a choice. You don't have to. When you can see it, when you're aware that the ego is just trying to hook you back in, it becomes so much easier to not follow that path again. And it really is interesting to see the ego playing itself out. It becomes quite entertaining at times. And that's where I'm at now, is coming back from a moment this morning of identifying with the ego again to some extent, and then experiencing since then more and more beauty, more and more peace, more and more awakeness and aliveness since I've identified it this morning. So I'm really happy that I have moved through it and didn't go down that rabbit hole again. And so I just wanted to chat a little bit about the ego and to say that there is support out there, there is help, and this is a beautiful journey that really can create a different world, a different life experience. And that's where I wanted to let people know that this is an option, that we can take this path if we choose to. And just getting the right support at the right time, it creates a whole new world of life experience. And so I'm really, really grateful for the support that I get, and for these opportunities where I get to see how my ego is playing out. Because the next time it comes along, I won't be as fooled by it. And that excites me. That makes me feel like I'm getting somewhere. I don't know where I'm getting, but to be in the experience of awakeness is so amazing in itself, that is the experience I want to be having. That's the experience I choose to be having for most of the time now. And it's just such a contrast from how I used to live my life. From living in ego and such volatile, tumultuous emotions that I used to experience, so up and down all the time, and being an empath and feeling what others are feeling, it made my emotions feel bigger and harder to overcome. So being a sensitive empath, I felt would be, or would create more of a challenge for me in awakening. But the more that I walk this path, the more that I see that it's not an issue. Everything is perfectly as it should be, and I don't need to try and force it or control it, or I don't need to try and make it something that is not, or believe the thoughts that it should be different or it should be something else. Just being in that space creates the desire to be more in that space. And it's really so simple, it's so easy, because you don't have to go anywhere. All you have to do is allow yourself to see that the ego is playing its games. So I would recommend that people go for the awakening experience and have that initial glimpse of it, have that initial experience of being in that space. And from there, just make sure you have some support, someone you can turn to and check in with, and someone who can hold you in that space so that you can begin to see how your ego is playing itself out and how it's separating you from everything around you, because ultimately there is no separation. When we are living in the awake space, we get to see that there's only one thing happening, there's only one thing going on, and it's the ego that's creating that sense of separation. So that's all for now, and I wish you well, and please reach out. Let's have this conversation because it wants to be had. So enjoy your afternoon, and I will chat to you again soon.